Lahore to study fine art, and I remember when I came into Lahore College as a young student, she was already a legend. She was almost a recluse. She would be seen disappearing into the distance with a canvas in one hand and paints in the other, and then we wouldn't hear of her for days. Years later, she was a founding member of the Fine Arts Department at the University of Sindh in Jamshoro. Over the years, one has researched her work. When I looked at her work, when I was preparing for my book on women artists of Pakistan, Unveiling the Visible, I, for the first time, got a sense of the breadth of her work, a vision I was always aware of. I hope you will be able to see the exhibition that has been mounted at National College of Arts. It was supposed to be next door, but that is another story. We are very, very delighted that NCA stepped in and hosted both the exhibition of Shamsa and of Musarrat Mirza, both invited by the Lahore Literary Festival. It's to the Lahore Literary Festival that we owe this opportunity to honor a painter who has worked totally from her environment, the colors and the moods of the landscape of Sindh, the dark alleyways, the washed colors which have been whitened by the sun, the textures of the sand. And if you climb up on her roof, which is next to the shrine of Masoom Shah, and look out at the city of Sakkar, you get a sense of the millenniums that are there before her feet and which she has observed day by day, night by night in her works. She is a devotee of Sufism, and you get that sense of calm and of deep poetry and commitment when you view her work. We are so delighted, Excellency, that you have joined us today to present this award to Musarrat Mirza, a Lifetime Achievement Award. Welcome. We'd like to invite you, Musarrat, onto the stage to take the award.
So it's an honor, Madam, to present to you this award from the festival this year. Congratulations.
It's my honor.
Always a person of few words, you have to go and see her painting.
It seems it's always, a dangerous game to give a micro to an ambassador, because he's always going to keep it, actually. So if you allow me, I've been asked by the organizer just to say a few words before you start your debate. I wanted just to say that it's, first of all, I would like to thank the organizer who gave me this opportunity to say these few words. And also to say that it's the first time for me and my wife actually to attend this festival. We arrived in Pakistan only 4 months ago. And my collaborators in my embassy have told me, we have to support this festival and we have to do it. And I told them, why? I mean, because European Union, we are not so much, involved on cultural activities. So why should we support this literary festival of Lahore? And I've been here since this morning, and I perfectly understand why they have been pushing me to be partner of the festival. And I would like also, again, to congratulate the organizers, because I know how, especially the last days, how it has been difficult to keep this festival going, and I think it's worth to do it, and I would like, again, to congratulate them. I'm very very pleased also to see that there are obviously guests from Pakistan, from neighboring countries, it's very important. Guests also from other continents, even from the European Union member states. This morning there was a debate with a citizen from Italy, a citizen from Sweden. And if you allow me one remark, there was a question from Ahmed Rashid on the situation in the European Union, on the so-called refugee/migration crisis in Europe. It's clear that first of all what my two colleagues from Italy and from Sweden, what they replied, I think was very right. That there is a change which is going to happen in Europe, and it has to change, it has to happen. Probably it is happening very quickly, and it's why we have this kind of strong reaction from some people back in Europe. But I think it's also important for the European Union citizens to remember that the key principle on which the European Union was founded more than 60 years ago is solidarity. It's solidarity among European citizens, but also nowadays it's solidarity with the rest of the world. And it's what it is about, and it's what we have to fight for, and it's what I'm fighting for, at least as the ambassador here in Pakistan, because it's what I trust. If I may now move to your discussion on feminism, on global politics. Both subjects are very close to the heart of the European Union. Feminism, because the EU has been always trying, and is still trying, even if it is not always easy, to put gender equity in the center stage of our policies, both inside the European Union, but also in our relationship with our partner countries. And it's something which is really something we are fighting for. Global politics, clearly, it's because it's part of our DNA as the European Union. We are doing politics and we are doing global politics, there is no doubt. Maybe one, if I look at how women have been involved in European politics over the last decades, if I look at one example, which is the European Parliament, where we had the first election in 1979, only 17% of the seats were actually devoted to women, have been elected for women. Today, in 2014, the last election, we are now 37% of the seats are occupied by women. It's better, it's still not equality, but we are going there hopefully step by step. But the question I would like to ask to the panel is another issue I would like to mention. We know also that there is more and more the last months traction for having the next UN Secretary General going into institutions which have been designed and shaped by men, actually, mostly by men. So, what is the power of women when they enter into this very male-dominated or male-designed institution to reshape them, to make sure that they will fit better, the future of our world? So it's an open question. And I think I will stop here my speech, because I think everybody is going to listen to you, which is much more important. I had one, I forgot the last one. So I wanted to tell you more. Yes, an important one. Feminism. I see that on the panel we have only women. So it's maybe also my last remark is feminism only about a fight only driven by women, or should we have also maybe men also involved into that? For me the reply is very simple. Men should be also joining hands with women on feminism. Thank you very much all of you, and have a good
Thank you for that. Congratulations on that wonderful Lifetime Achievement Award, and welcome to you all to join this panel discussion and debate on feminism and global politics. My name's Rachel Holmes. I'm a biographer, a writer, and I write mostly about feminist subjects. My last one was Eleanor Marx, and my current one is Sylvia Pankhurst, who bears some relevance to our current discussion. It's my great pleasure today to be able to introduce and be in discussion with a terrific panel that we have here. Mona Eltahawy to my left, Anita Anand, and Dina Siddiqi. I'm just going to introduce them briefly. Many of you will know she is the author of Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Mona, so welcome. Anita Anand is, amongst many other things, BBC presenter of Any Answers on BBC Radio 4. She's also a BBC TV presenter, and she's worked on The Daily Politics, Newsnight, Drive, and my favourite, The Anita Anand Show on Radio 5 Live. She's also the author of one of my very favourite biographies, obviously apart from my own of the last 2 years, which is Sophia, Princess, Suffragette, Revolutionary. A brilliant and groundbreaking biography about Sophia Dulit-Singh, whose family and history will be known to many of you here. So Anita, welcome. And finally, but not least, Dina Siddiqi, researcher and writer who divides her time between New York and Dhaka, where she teaches anthropology at Brack University. Now, whatever you make of its conclusions, whether you agree with them or not, feminism is the oldest democratic movement in the world. And it has always been a global movement. Just because we don't have a joined up history and just because we all come from different places doesn't mean that it is born in one place. It is also largely a surprisingly non-violent movement. Even the militant British suffragettes who blew up post boxes, who blew up houses, who threw bricks, somehow managed to never actually kill anyone apart from themselves. It's extraordinary. But nevertheless, here we still are in 2016, and global patriarchy does not seem to be quite eradicated. I doubt we're going to achieve that within the next 50 minutes, but we can certainly get some insights from our eminent panelists. Mona, starting with you, I wonder if you could just give us a brief introduction of partly what brought you to write the book, but also, I think, particularly politically, where Egypt is positioned at almost a kind of part of the centre of the world on this. Whether you could just comment on that for us.
Hello, can everybody hear me? Because this is important. Before I say anything, fuck the patriarchy. It's good to get that clear. So about my book. What led me to write the book was when the revolution started in Tunisia, because let's remember they started in Tunisia, much as us Egyptians are very chauvinist and proprietal over this, they did start in Tunisia. When those revolutions began, we saw these amazing scenes that people never expected people from my part of the world to enact, and that is men and women rising up against decades of dictatorships that were propped up by money and weapons from the US, from Saudi Arabia, from the Europeans, etc. What those men and women were rising up against was a state that oppresses everyone. But it became increasingly apparent that we had to ask what happened when women went home. And they looked to the left and to the right to see the men who marched with them against that state that oppresses everyone, and wonder, because I think there's a false notion that men who are activists and men who are revolutionaries are de facto feminists, or at least not misogynist bastards, and that is not true. Just because you're a revolutionary does not make you a feminist. So when women in Tunisia and Egypt and Syria and Yemen and Bahrain went home and looked at the men that they marched with and risked their lives with, it became apparent, especially when we saw things like the Egyptian military in Egypt sexually violating women through so-called virginity tests, when we saw the Assad regime and the so-called rebels in Syria raping women, when we saw Gaddafi and his history of sexual violence in Libya, it became apparent that if the state oppresses everyone, the state, the street, and the home together oppress women and girls. And I call that the trifecta of misogyny. And I wrote my book because I wanted, because these revolutions were things that we had waited for all our lives. All our lives. And finally, that moment had come. But these revolutions were not about gender equality. These revolutions were not about feminism. These revolutions, it became apparent, were about men fighting other men in a game of musical chairs. Because there's a Mubarak on the street corner and there's a Mubarak in the bedroom. And so it's my contention, and that's what I weave throughout the book, that unless we overthrow that Mubarak on the street corner and that Mubarak in the bedroom, our political revolution against the Mubaraks, plural, in the presidential palace will fail. So that's where my book comes in. But where it comes in specifically personally for me is that I am Egyptian and I am American. And I have dual citizenship. And I identify as a global feminist. And what does global feminism mean? I will expand on it later, but just to kick things off. Global feminism, one aspect for me is, in Egypt, I fight against that military that sexually violated women's bodies, because Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is a fascist dictator. I fight against political Islam in any form. I was absolutely against the massacre of the Muslim Brotherhood, but I absolutely oppose the politics of the Muslim Brotherhood. So I fight against the military, the Muslim Brotherhood, but I also fight against what I call the Christian Brotherhood in the United States, and against any kind of brotherhood in which men use religion, and every religion, there is no religion on earth that does not use religion to benefit men and to be superior and to use women's bodies and to obsess over women's bodies. And every religion, my message is very simple, whether it's Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, whatever you want to call it. My message to the Muslim Brotherhood, the Christian Brotherhood, the Hindu Brotherhood, the Jewish Brotherhood is stay out of my vagina unless I want you in there.
Thank you, Mona. Dina Siddiqi, you live and work between New York and Dhaka. Do you find that is there a difference, a bifurcation in what the different struggles of feminism are, or do you find that that's continuous wherever you are?
That's a good question. First of all, let me just say, I think I'm going to be a little bit provocative here, because as a feminist, and as somebody who considers herself to be a transnational feminist, I have a lot of criticism of what I would call liberal feminism. So yes, I actually think that women are connected globally in very through structures of power, through geopolitics, through economy. I study women who work in factories. If you're going to study women in factories, you have to study the US economy. You have to study trade regimes, all kinds of things, okay? So that being said, I just want to say that as somebody who travels between New York and Bangladesh, one of the things that when I'm in the US that I constantly face is this, you could say, enlistment or hijacking of feminism in the project of empire. And I feel that it's very important for us to, and there's a long history of that. I don't think all feminisms are innocent. And again, I'm very much a feminist, but I think there's a long history in India, I'm sure many of you know, of this idea of the British coming to civilize Indian culture through civilizing its women. And as Gayatri Spivak put it many years ago, white men stealing brown women from brown men. That kind of civilizational discourse has really reappeared post 9/11. And I think it saturates the discourse on development, the discourse on feminism, and it's something that we really have to confront. And there's this idea, and I think it has to do with how we think about Islam. Bangladesh is a Muslim majority country. There is this idea about Muslim majority societies. And it's something that's been reinforced since 9/11, that Muslims do what they do because they are Muslim. And so this reduction of religion really ends up erasing politics, erasing history, displacing the political onto the cultural. And I want to give an example. I mean, we can talk about this more later, of how these things affect women's lives. So David Cameron, quite astonishingly, a couple of weeks ago, launched a fund to teach immigrant Muslim women, not non-Muslim women, who I'm sure also could use the services, to teach them English, right? And why was he doing this? Apparently he is doing this in order to prevent militancy. I just want to unpack that for a minute in light of this older history of the appropriation of feminist language for empire. So Cameron says something like, he uses this idea of learning English and presumably to become British. There's this idea of British values that will be imbibed through learning the language itself. And there's this idea that, of course, Muslim men, because they're Muslim, don't have those values. You liberate Muslim women, civilize Muslim men, and produce proper non-jihadi citizens. Now, my question to that is, where is the link? I'd like to know. I think it's great if women, there are women in Chinatown in New York who don't know how to speak English either. It's fabulous that the state provides those kind of services to all women. But where is that link? It's an ideological link. And it has to do with this idea of Muslims as a race who are not quite civilized, who will be civilized through a particular kind of quote-unquote Euro-American education. So you educated, you become British, you become civilized, you become Euro-American. And I think the hysteria over migrants in Europe very much ties into that. I just saw a cover of a Polish magazine in which a white woman is apparently it's called The Rape of Europe and by Muslim men. And it's using that same logic of this fear. And what in reaction to that, the governments have put in so-called, teaching Muslim men to become civilized, to have codes of conduct, when they should be wondering about how, for instance, what happened in Germany on New Year's Eve. Maybe they should be doing more about having in place structures that stop violence against women. So that's where I'll leave it for now.
Anita, you went back to the to a century ago, to the early 20th century to write your fabulous book, Sophia. But at the same time, you're a journalist, a commentator, an analyst who's working very much on contemporary politics. And I wonder if, as well as telling us something about how you came to Sophia and how that book came about, the connections for you between those two things, your sort of working political journalism life and then writing that history. We need a mic fix, please.
Can you hear me? Oh, there we are. Hello. Hello, everyone. So, let me first of all just tell you that I had a real feeling when I was listening to Mona speaking in particular, that plus ça change, and I'll come to that in a moment, and so that the contemporary thing. But first of all, for those of you who don't know who Sophia Dilip Singh was, she very much is a daughter of Lahore. So her grandfather was Ranjit Singh. If you go to Lahore, as I did this morning, you'll see that beautiful white tomb of his in the heart of the old city. She, though, did not grow up here in the seat of her family. She was born in England and brought up in England at a time when women were perhaps at their lowest ebb in society. And this is, an irony, because there was a queen on the throne. Queen Victoria was the symbol of great potency. Now, it did not come with this great veneration of a woman on the throne that people respected women very much indeed. In fact, they were barred after having some levels of freedom. I think things dipped in the Victorian era for women, so they weren't allowed to work, they weren't recognised, they had very little rights over their own children. In divorces, they had nothing. They were often left destitute by philandering partners. Their lot was a terrible one, and that's the society in which this Indian princess grows up. She's a goddaughter of Queen Victoria, in fact. And for a while, she lives this charmed life as a socialite. She's photographed in every magazine, she's a fashion icon, she's a champion dog breeder, she's a hockey player. She's one of the first women to ride a bicycle in Britain, which in itself was an act of great feminism and defiance, because women weren't meant to ride bicycles. The placement of the saddle caused unnecessary excitement and made them all go crazy. This is an actual argument made by medics at the time. So this is the era that we were talking about. And yet, instead of staying in this kind of funk of being coddled and cosseted in this lovely life, Sophia turns into this battling, militant, fighting suffragette who would have been completely at home in some of those protests you talked about at Tahrir Square, by the way. The protests of the suffragette movement, which were not so very long ago, really, in the scheme of things, considering for the book I interviewed real living human beings who knew this woman, this princess. What changed this woman? And it was actually Lahore, your city here, changed this woman. Because after having this charmed life, she came to see the Delhi Darbar, the greatest show on earth, a celebration of the accession of King Edward to the throne. And then she came to her old kingdom, the land of her grandfather, Ranjit Singh. And she saw that even though in England she was this minor pet celebrity, here in old India, she was no better than a coolie, like everybody else of colour. And that is where the rage started. Suddenly, it was not enough for her to be this pointless paparazzi, annoying princess. Suddenly, she had to do something more. So when she came back to England, she saw this same struggle and felt the same anger and rage rising, which very much, as you said, Mona, about, this is, and in fact, Dina, you as well, touching on this, that these are issues of inequality. Feminism does not have a big vaginal wall around it. These are issues of equality and justice. And so that same cry that she heard among the nationalists in Lahore, Awaz do, Awaz do, Awaz do, she heard it on the streets of Britain. Give us a voice. Give us a voice. So, through time, we can almost link hands. You, her, you, all across the world, not just global, but through epochs. That this struggle, plus ça change, things don't change. And just very briefly, and then I will shut up because the conversation is much more interesting. The use of sexual violence I find really very, very interesting because Mona has written deeply, movingly and powerfully about what you have gone through and what other women have gone through. During the suffragette era, and remember this is the Victorian era, what was the #1 method the police used to subdue the suffragettes? It was sexual violence. There are boxes and boxes of testimony from women. Outside outside Big Ben, now many of you who've been to London will know this square very well, Parliament Square, the mother of all parliaments, and they would come in small groups to petition the Prime Minister, politely, as is their right, to say, look, we want to talk to you about giving women a voice. And they would be met by groping, their clothes would be torn, they'd be dragged around walls, thrown into groups of men by policemen, by officials of the state who would say, here, take these, and forgive me for the language, although you've forgiven her, so I've got no problems, but take these bitches and do whatever you want with them. Those same reports you could read today from Tahrir Square, and that depresses me, but the fight in the women who will not sit down, as they didn't, and your women don't, and you don't, inspires me still.
Anita, I'm so glad you brought that up because I was speaking in Derry, in Northern Ireland, a few months ago, about sex and the sexual revolution, and I told the women in the room, it was this feminist group in Derry, who somehow knew about my work and said, will you come and talk about what's happening in Egypt? And I gladly went, and I told them exactly what happened to me. Some of you might know that in November of 2011, Egyptian riot police broke both my arms and sexually assaulted me, and at least 12 other women were sexually assaulted in an almost identical fashion as I was, and I retold this story. And so many Irish women would tell me of the sexual violence that they experienced during the so-called Troubles, but connecting it even more, and this is why that global thread is so important. A woman in the audience who'd written a history of the suffragists. In the US, we call them suffragists. US feminists get all, no suffragettes, because of the TES. But anyway, suffragettes. And she wrote and told me, when you talked about the systematic way that you and the 12 other women were sexually assaulted on that night in November of 2011, I found in my research an almost identical, systematic, where they entrap you, they play good cop, bad cop, they rip your clothes off, they rope you. And this one particular incident that was notorious was called Black Friday or something, in which exactly the same way that I had described being sexually assaulted, these women were sexually assaulted. It's incredible.
Black Friday, I have to keep holding this, I think either my voice is weak or the microphone is weak, but together we'll get through it. So Black Friday was the most shameful episode, I think, in British parliamentary history. I truly believe it, and it was the last-ditch chance for the suffragettes to get what they wanted. In 1911, they were as close as they ever got to getting the vote. They weren't going to get the vote equally. Only some women would be given the vote, women over 30 and women who owned property. And then at the last minute, the Prime Minister at the time, Asquith, who had a pathological hatred of strong women, decided he was going to kill the bill. And so this march took place on Westminster, led by Emmeline Pankhurst and, as it happens, Sophia Dilip Singh, an Indian princess. And there's this whole thing of otherness, you know, like, why is this brown woman fighting for white women? You know, this thing was asked again and again at the time. But they got to Parliament, they couldn't even walk all together. They had to walk in small groups of 12, otherwise they would have been arrested before they even got into the shadow of Parliament. And as soon as they got there, they were pounced on. Winston Churchill, who was the Home Secretary, said, I don't want any arrests because I don't want my prisons cluttered up with these women who then really tediously go on hunger strike and embarrass us. So just make them go home, tire them out. And so that was a mandate for this wholesale sexual assault that lasted 5.5 hours. And every time these women were thrown down, they got up. Every single time. And that, to me, is just an eye-watering bravery. That, again, as you say, you could change the titles, take a pen, change the places, change the names, and it's the same.
Right. Yeah, I just want to add to that, saying that I think we have to remember that gender and sexuality are always modes of controlling population and also creating difference among populations. And that, as you were saying, inequality is very central to that. So not all women are necessarily always attacked. Some women are more privileged than other women. So if we think of the South under slavery, for instance, and if we think about the relationship between white women and black women, we can't really talk about, you know, all women facing the same kinds of violence. Certainly white women face certain kinds of policing of their respectability. But the black woman's body and access to the black woman's body secured a kind of racial purity. And sexual violence was very central to that. But it was also very much about dividing women, not just, or you know, the rape of Dalit women by upper caste men. It's very much about policing communal boundaries, or what happened in, obviously, during the partition of British India. So there's that, and just one more issue about gender equality. You raised it, and I think you referred to it as well, which is that I think, certainly, and going back to your question, Your Excellency, I think, to me at least, feminism is not simply about gender equality, and gender equality simply because not all women are structurally placed in the same way. But to bring about equality means to bring about a change in social structures, social transformation, a change in power structures. So obviously it is about men, but it is also about people of different classes. So in Bangladesh, for instance, even, you know, you can have gender equality legally in certain realms, but a lot of women fall out of that. The women who are being displaced because of development policy, the poor women, the ethnic women who are being displaced because you have open pit coal mining. You know, there's, you know, when we're talking about gender equality, I think it's very important not to homogenize this category of women either. So
there's a really funny thing as well, which is that the baddies are always on the same side.
Yeah.
So at the time of the suffragettes, there was a man who founded the Anti-Suffrage League, which only existed to stop women from getting the vote. And you might be familiar with his name. His name was Curzon. He was a former viceroy of India. So he'd been in India, he had ruled with an iron fist in India, he then went back, supposedly for this quiet retirement, and was incensed by all of these British women going nuts. He's like, what's wrong with them? Our daughters have gone nuts. They're asking for the vote. It's bizarre. So he set up this foundation to stop them from getting the vote. And his argument was lovely. He had these pamphlets, 5-point pamphlets about why you shouldn't. And chief among them was, if you give women the vote, we will lose the empire. Because how can brown people respect us if we listen to our women?
With him, Lord Cromer, who was the High Commissioner in Egypt, and in Egypt, Lord Cromer was all feminism, let's liberate Egyptian women. Whereas in the UK, he was absolutely against the enfranchisement of women. And one of the points I make in my book is that for me as a Muslim woman and as a feminist, I'm very aware of that very ugly history of empire in our various parts of the world. I'm very aware of the fact, because I lived in the US at the time, that George W. Bush gave his weekly radio address to Laura Bush so she could plead the case for invading Afghanistan to quote-unquote liberate Afghan women from their burqas, because it was made to seem like we're going in there for a woman. It had fuck all to do with women. So I'm very well aware of that line that you could trace, but I'm also very well aware that we cannot, because of that ugly history, remain quiet, because historically we have had to fight all of these enemies. As that Egyptian, as that Muslim, as that feminist, I can't afford to be, I'm not a white feminist obviously, but I can't afford to listen and be patient with what we now call white feminism, because white feminism has the luxury of fighting just sexism or just misogyny. As all of those identifiers that I have, I fight misogyny, I fight patriarchy, I fight racism, I fight homophobia, I fight all of these isms that as a brown woman, as a woman of color that makes her way through the world, I'm aware of. And I'm aware that especially that fight where racism and sexism are involved, we cannot privilege one or the other. We, and here I'm now talking to Pakistani women, and you understand exactly what I'm talking about. When our men talk about how, if we talk about these things, you're going to make us look bad, and the Islamophobes will have weapons and ammunition to use against us, what they're essentially saying is, shut up. It's not time for you to be free yet. And yet, you know, we can help them in that fight. But when we call on them to fight alongside us against their misogyny and anybody else's misogyny, they're not there. This is why I'm saying this trifecta of misogyny is so important, because you have to fight both. You can't privilege racism over sexism. We have to fight all kinds of isms to get that equality, because as women of color, that is our key to freedom.
I just sort of had two observations. So you know there was this film, Suffragette, which came out. And it's just, although I completely hear what you say, and a lot of it beats in time with my heart, I just think we also have to be careful about alienating those women who are white and who are fighting. So I'll just tell you how, because it's a tool that's used against us, and I'll tell you a very real example. After the film Suffragette came out, I had so many journalists ringing me up saying, aren't you angry? Aren't you angry though because Sophia wasn't in it? Is that racist? Has that been, are they being racist? And they really wanted me to slate the film, which I refused to. Go see the film. It's a really, you know, it's a great reminder. So that's just the thing. It's like, I believe in that to get, yeah, I see, but I would have loved it if she was in it, but I can completely, you know, it's a story about her particularly, and they were being angry on my behalf. Everyone was sort of taking up cudgels on behalf of me. And actually my thinking is, it would have been great, but this was a story about a particular woman.
But she was fictional, and Sophia was real.
Right, she was real,
so
but
I was angry.
I know, but then, you know, watch this space, by the way. She deserves a film of her own, watch this space. But you know, what I was worried about is that there were male journalists ringing me up wanting me to do this, and I wasn't going to do it, and I won't do it, and I still think, go see the film. I didn't feel that rage. And the other thing, there was another sort of film-related thing. It'll come to me in a minute, I've lost the skip.
I don't think at all that there should be a choice between racism and sexism. I think we have to understand problems as being deeply entangled in each other, so I don't think the enemy is ever just race or sex. I do realize that sometimes when we're talking to an audience that's foreign, there is pressure to self-censor, which is what you're talking about, like not have your dirty laundry out there in the public. But there is another way to think about it, which is that sometimes, certainly, and I'm going to talk from the perspective of somebody who studies women in Bangladesh, that which is very much steeped in a certain kind of donor-driven economy, even the question of what kinds of problems are important to women can be shaped by these larger structures of knowledge production. So yes, maybe it's very interesting about, you know, so some things will seem more apparent, some things will offend certain moral sensibilities more than others. So as feminists, I think we have to really be concerned about how the transnational, how the global shapes the way in which somehow we have access to funds, the kinds of problems we think are important to fight. I think there's something there that in which the place of Islamophobia today is very, very important. So somehow fighting Islam or banishing Islam becomes very important in the larger development discourse. And I think there's a way in which Islam is folded into inequality, and it really does affect women's and men's lives. But it affects it very differently for different groups of people, whether they're rural, urban, upper class, middle class. And so I don't think it's an either-or issue.
And the other thing, I've just remembered the other thing now as well, you reminded me. So it was your question about where men sit in this struggle. Every man, one of you, should call yourself a feminist. You should be feminist too. What does it mean? It means about fighting for a better, more just world. That's as simple. And you know, again, the film thing, the other observation I wanted to make about the suffragette movie, they had a fictionalized account of a bomb-making scenario where there was a chemist, it was Helena Bonham Carter in the film who made these bombs. Actually, that's based on a real-life thing. It was a man called Edwy Cautain who belonged to the Kingston branch of the suffragettes, who was a chemist, who made bombs for them and told them how best to set fire to things. So, you know, ever since the beginning, there have been men fighting shoulder to shoulder, and there should be more of them. And, you know, in countries like Sweden, the Feminist Party gets male votes. It gets huge support. So I think every man Jack of you and every man Jamshed of you out there should be a feminist too.
I agree. Sorry, can I just add about, I want to address the ambassador and what he said. I don't believe a man belongs on this stage. I think enough panels have men on them. The fight is the other way round. We need more women on more panels, not the other way round. And number two, yes, you all should be feminists because feminism is about equality and justice. But here's what really pisses me off about male feminists. You constantly want to talk for us. This is what pisses me off about white feminism too. And you know, by white feminism, I'm not talking about specific white women. I'm talking about a kind of feminism that historically has addressed just specifically misogynist and just certain privilege levels of women. So when I say white feminism, I'm talking about the kind of feminism that I said has the luxury to focus just on misogyny. All of those have had voices much longer than we have had, or I won't say we, I'll speak for myself, that women of color have had as voices. So when you look at a movement right now in the United States, which I consider a revolutionary movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, it was launched by 3 queer black women. And in many instances, when the Black Lives Matter movement would have meetings and they would say, we don't want any white people to come. And you get all these white people really upset. And why are they upset? White people dominate everything in the US, and I have no compunction saying it like this. It is about race, it is about sex, it is about religion, it is about money, it is about all of those things. And there are certain spaces that must be ours because we have been banned from those places and we've never had the room to talk about those things. So yes, there are stages in which only women belong. Yes, there are discussions in which only Muslim women should talk. And yes, there are places in which only women of color should talk because we have been denied those spaces for too long.
One line, you're right. So maybe it's hard to talk about we as women. I think that's also, I mean, at least I feel that way. That there are just too many cleavages and you need to be constantly conscious of the power relations within which we are embedded as privileged people. And not just white women either, we as upper class women in South Asia, for instance. And our relationships to other people. And then of course it flips, of course, you know, in relation to empire, of course everything changes. But
thank you. I'd like to open up for questions from the floor now. So do we have any house lights, or do I have to do this? And because I need to be able to see. And are there any roving mics at all? Or people? Yeah? Okay.
Okay, lovely session. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah. So I guess one of the things I want to say is why then
talk about global feminism, because that is precisely the problem that I think, Dina, you alluded to. Why not call it transnational, which is the word that is being used to question the power relations that are still implicit in the word global sisterhood and global feminism, because that is still located in the Western, sort of hemisphere, whereas transnational is much more, much more appropriate term for the kind of work that all of you are talking and representing, and takes into account, so I think we have to really rethink the vocabulary, and I think global is very problematic. Number two, for Mona especially, I'd like to ask what you think of the sort of hijabification that has happened in Muslim societies. You talk about spaces for Muslim women, but within Muslim women there are so many different kinds of Muslim women, including within Pakistan, including within Egypt, and and I'm referring of course to the idea of the politics of piety. What do you have to say about that? Thank you.
Do you want me to answer the question about global? Because Dina uses transnational.
I'll answer the question about globalisation, but simply to say we have great programmes at this festival, and I'm sure that they will take on board the fact that we can, and I will officially change global to transnational now. So let's part that.
I'm not using globalisation. I'm intentionally using global because I think most people don't understand what transnational means. And I actually want to use language that many people can understand. I'm not an academic. I don't use academic language. I say fuck, sex and vagina very intentionally because I think the ordinary person understands what fuck, sex and vagina is. And when I say global, what I mean is there is a feminist movement in China, and the women in China who tried to march on International Women's Day were sent to jail for almost a month. They're now called the Feminist Five. There are women in India who are fighting since the Delhi bus gang rape against sexual violence. There are women in Turkey and Afghanistan who have been fighting against, for example, taking part in public funeral ceremonies, going against conservative Islamic teaching and demanding the right to bury women who have suffered tremendous violence. And there are women in the US that I mentioned who formed the Black Lives Matter movement who recognize very much that when they go to vote, white women vote for the GOP candidates that I mentioned are the Christian Brotherhood of the United States, because those same white women in the US are, especially the richer, wealthier white women in the US, can afford to travel for miles and miles and go get an abortion somewhere, whereas in a state like Texas, all but 8 abortion clinics have been closed down, which affects more women of color, whether they're Latinas or black women in Texas. So when I say global, I'm connecting China to Turkey to Afghanistan to India to the United States. I'm not saying globalization, I'm saying the world. That's to answer your first question.
Respond to that, but what do those women necessarily have in common except that they're women? I mean, what does Black Lives... I think that we end up perhaps collapsing too many differences if we want to keep using the word global. Which has a very burdened history. It really brings up this older history of this Robin Williams sisterhood is global kind of, actually, and I do think there are enough critiques of that now. We don't all share the same problems, even if there is sexual violence that we're all could be subjected to at any point in time. What we share, I mean, the connection between Black Lives Matter, for instance, at some level, and the war in Gaza, one of the connections that women in Black Lives Matter would be connected to Gaza is that the police in Washington DC actually get their training from the people from the police, from the military, from the IDF in Israel. That's a connection. Okay, so I don't think that just we as women have something together that always necessarily ties us together, and I do think that we can change vocabulary. I understand what you're saying about academic language. Transnational is really about how different nations are connected through circuits of inequality, and global is a very happy feeling that perhaps, I see what you're saying, but I can't, I think that we can start talking about transnational rather than global, and it could replace it.
Do you have something to say on the hijabification question?
No, not so much on the hijabification, that's definitely a major thing, but just on language. I mean, look, I just don't care that much about the term. I care about what is done. The suffragettes had a really neat line, it was deeds, not words, and that's what matters to me. Call it globalization, call it transnational. I'll give you just a perspective from history. So historically, and again, this is the whole, that I do truly believe in the sisterhood. I believe in the sisterhood. I do believe in the sisterhood. The suffragettes, at their time, in here, and this is, again, what you were saying about the virginity tests. One of their main campaigns was about the forced testing of women on the streets here, around cantonments, around where British troops were. Women would be dragged to the side and they would be forced, fingers would be inserted to see whether they were carrying sexual diseases. Nobody ever told the soldiers to stop sleeping around, to stop this voracious spread of sexual diseases. It was the women who were dragged and assaulted in this way. And the white, British, middle-class, privileged suffragettes were the ones who kind of put an end to it, shamed the government into changing that. Deeds, not words, that's all.
I also do not want to get into an argument about global versus transnational, but I think this is exactly the price that we pay as women of colour, and that is what connects us. It's our being women of colour, and I think that as women of colour, we're constantly, this is why I said earlier, we're constantly made to choose racism over sexism, for example, or constantly made to make the kind of negotiations that you're talking about. Oh, it's the police here and the police there. No, it's about women, and I will always privilege women over everything while I fight racism and Islamophobia. I never ally myself with the right wing or with the racists, but at the same time, I will not ever put women and girls underneath all these other things that many, unfortunately, from an academic community or from the so-called left, constantly put on women. And so women have this checklist, and we have to go through this whole thing, and our issues are down here. No, I connect women in China and Turkey and Afghanistan and India and Black America and Egypt, because we women as girls are specifically targeted for women that affect us and women and girls. We could talk about this forever, but I agree it's about deeds and not words. And this is why I want to address your issue about hijab. Listen, I wore hijab for 9 years. I chose to wear hijab at 16, and I chose to take off hijab at 25. And you know what? It took me 8 years to take it off. Why did it take me 8 years to take it off? Because it's easier for us as Muslims, and this is why I called my book Headscarves and Hymens, because as Muslim women, by Muslims around us and non-Muslims, we're reduced to what's on our head and what's in between our legs. And it's easier to choose to wear hijab than to choose to take it off. And that is a truth too many people want to deny. And when it comes to modesty, this is how I feel about modesty. I now reject hijab absolutely and utterly, and I reject hijab. My mother wears hijab, my sister wears hijab, 90% of Egyptian women wear hijab. And I reject hijab because it's part of what I call modesty culture, that unfairly burdens girls and women in the same way that purity culture in the United States that makes teenage girls sign their virginity to their fathers in a pledge also unfairly burdens girls and women. Why should I cover myself up to ensure either safe passage in public space or to ensure I don't tempt men? Where the fuck are men in this? Where is the modesty of men? Why aren't men covering their eyes? I am done as a Muslim woman. Again, his mother has a PhD in wears hijab and his sister's doing a PhD in wears hijab. I am sick and fucking tired of the hijab. And you know what? I say this, you know what? In the United States right now we have that racist, fascist, bigoted shit called Donald Trump, who's saying, I want to ban Muslim women from the US. And you know what? He wants Muslims to wear identity badges. Muslim women who already do wear identity badges through their veils. And they are on the front line right now of Islamophobic attacks. And I recognize that, and I absolutely and utterly condemn anyone who attacks a Muslim woman because she's wearing hijab. But at the same time, I will not sit by and quietly clap for hijabi Barbie. I will not sit by and clap for fucking Dolce & Gabbana and their hijab for $5,000. I will not support any kind of veiling or any kind of modesty culture that unfairly burdens girls and women anywhere in the world, especially where I come from.
We're actually just about out of time, so I'm going to ask Nina, we don't even have time for another question because I've got to go and do another event. Would you like to come back on that?
Would I like to? Yes. I think the question is not about whether or not you fight for the hijab or not. That's your personal decision. I think let's take Donald Trump. What he's trying to do, when he's demonizing Muslims or anyone else in the U.S. right wing, when they're demonizing Muslims, they're using the body and this idea that Islam always oppresses women in order to make their larger political point. And I think as feminists, as Muslim women, I don't wear a hijab. I don't think about the hijab. It's irrelevant to my life, frankly. But I'm not going to.
You have the privilege to have it irrelevant to your life. 90%
of women here don't. True, but anyway.
That's a privilege.
I forgot. But the point is that somebody like Donald Trump can do what he can do politically, because there is this a larger kind of template through which you can use women's bodies. But not all women's bodies mean the same thing. But Muslims' women's bodies, whether they are covered or uncovered, I will say today, mean a certain thing. So in places like Bangladesh, if you're uncovered, the public space is supposed to be secular. If you're covered, or in France, for instance, the public space suddenly becomes contaminated. But Muslim women's bodies have a particular kind of valence, I think, and that becomes a real problem. And as a feminist, I think it's a problem I want to unpack. And I think it's really important to do. I don't have to choose between race and sex. I never have to choose. I never feel that that's a problem. I think things are deeply, deeply intertwined. And the Donald Trump example with Muslims just tells you that soon they're going to round us up and put them in camps, as they did with the Japanese. Muslims are no different. But it's that women are used in particular kinds of ways. It's very interesting. That doesn't mean feminism is the same for all women.
You said about women's lives. Last sentence, I promise. You said women's bodies. Donald Trump and the GOP, I already began with the GOP being the Christian Brotherhood, because Donald Trump is one of 10 men on that stage who obsess over women's vaginas, who are telling women in the United States when they can and can't have abortions. So Donald Trump talks about Muslims, he also talks about reproductive rights, as do all the others. So women are affected, so it's not about just the hijab, it's about all women's bodies, but we end up being too quiet about the hijab and what the hijab does to women in order to fight that. We can fight it all. That's what I think.
If the hijab is a problem, I don't think it's always a problem for everybody.
We really
I don't think we can speak for
have to wrap
everybody.
this up now, and it sounds like this conversation is going to go on right out the door and out there, and keep joining in with it. Thank you very much to all of you.